So when it comes to the DSM and the diagnostic dictionary, the primary organization of those is based on a cluster of symptoms. You have to diagnose a disease, you have to have a certain number of symptoms present, and then the symptoms have to be present for a certain amount of time, and then based on that you can make a diagnosis of a certain problem, and there are several different recognized problems. And based on those criteria, you have to kind of draw a conclusion about what the problem may be. There are lots of really pertinent issues that people have that are very well described. They're very well defined by the DSM, and they're all very much real conditions that people deal with, and they are organized based on their type. So they're kind of like schizotypal problems. There are bipolar problems. There are mood disorders. There are growth, like neurological development disorders, feeding disorders, and so on. And they're organized based on kind of the cluster of symptoms. But even so, many of those different types share symptoms, and it becomes a problem in recognizing the symptom. It becomes a problem in recognizing how that symptom contributes to the disease. It becomes a problem at sourcing the true reason behind that symptom, and also getting a history from a person. You're just asking them questions that sort of get them to admit whether or not they're dealing with that thing. And beyond that, there are things like medications and other stuff like that that may influence it. So while it's what we use, it's kind of the most like empirically accepted way to do things, there's still problems. People get misdiagnosed all the time, me included. But there seems to be some disparity between the categories and their true kind of definitions and so on. So I want to just go ahead and demonstrate that. And what I would like to do is list just a few diseases that are diagnosable in the DSM, and then I want to talk about how standard theory addresses those diseases. So I'll start listing some of them. So we have schizophrenia, which has a bunch of its own subtypes. We have the bipolar or the mood disorder, so go with bipolar disorder. And then next we have like attention disorders, so we have ADD, we have ADHD, we have OCD, and then we have depression, we have anxiety, we have PTSD or stress disorder, we have a personality disorder, and then we have autism. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9. So those are 10 different diseases, and most of these are going to be their own kind of category. We have schizotypal diseases, we have the mood disorders, the bipolar disorder, personality disorders, stress disorders, anxiety disorders. We have all these different things. I could probably add like feeding disorder, like bulimia. I'll go ahead and add like bulimia to this. And I'll also add anorexia to this. That's a dozen different disorders, and if you were to use the DSM, you would have to go to each one of these different things. You have to go from this chapter to that chapter. You have to learn all the different. You have to learn all the different symptoms of that. You'd have to learn all the different clusters. You'd have to learn about the kind of time frame that they've been happening. You have to figure out if there's anything else going on along with it. And it would be kind of difficult. It's a lot of jumping around, it's a lot of going back and forth. But in standard theory, all these are the same disorder. All these have the same terminal problem. All these are the same issue. And they are recognizable based on the characteristic that's associated with them. And the same way that we can just group things on, say this is the R scale, in the same way we can say this is the Z scale, we can organize these based on the communication type that is a problem or the thinking type that's a problem. So in standard theory, there are only 3 types of problems. And all of these fall under the problem type. All of this is part of something called intimacy dysfunction. So to explain that, the only thing we really need is the R scale. And what we're thinking of is the process of getting to the goal of communication. So the goal of our experiences, according to standard theory, is to experience something called constructive intimacy. And if you remember, there are a bunch of steps that are required to get there. There's the components of impulse in the Z0 scale. You have to go through that a certain number of times. Then you have to get all the prerequisites that happen in order to get to the faculty of intelligence. And then you have to go to the first characteristic, you have to go to the second characteristic, you have to go to the third characteristic, you have to go to the fourth characteristic, fifth characteristic, sixth characteristic, so on. You have to go through the whole process to actually get to the point where you can communicate with another person one-on-one directly, one person with exactly one other person, and kind of facilitate that dynamic exchange of information. And then you have to be able to move away from that and be able to either come back and try again later or do something else. So every one of these that are mentioned here are part of a process that interrupts intimacy dysfunction, and I can demonstrate that fairly quickly. So the first characteristic, if you think back to the standard and non-standard versions of the behavioral index, the first characteristic is something called self-identification, and that's where you reactivate an idea, you reactivate another idea, and then you make a connection between them. And when you're not able to do that in the non-standard way, you end up with a process called dissociation, meaning that you no longer consider at least one of the ideas. So let me kind of demonstrate that, so I'm kind of confuse myself. But we have the whole thing of reactivating an idea, and then making a connection between those ideas. So once it happens in a non-standard way, you don't consider that connection between them anymore. So it's no longer a characteristic now, it's just separate ideas. And if that process continues, then you end up with something called depersonalization, meaning that you don't consider the idea, you only have some other activity there that's causing that problem. And in schizophrenia, what we're seeing in a very deterministic way is a person who has some stimulation going on, and then they have some other experience, and then they try to make an idea between them, but they can't. There's some other problem that's preventing them from doing that, and that is essentially the thing. According to standard theory, that's what causes the entire set of symptoms that go along with schizophrenia. It's people moving in between achieving the first characteristic of communication and then losing the first characteristic of communication. And there are 2 different types of schizophrenia, according to standard theory. And hopefully these won't be confused with the types that are in the DSM, but they're called positive type schizophrenia and negative type schizophrenia. So what we will see in positive type schizophrenia, we have some experience or some other adulterant or some problem. We have some other experience or some other idea or some kind of thing. And whenever we make this connection between them, whatever that connection may be, in a standard sense, it's supposed to equal 3 units. But for whatever reason, it's not equaling 3 units. That first characteristic is not standard. There's some problem with it. So there are a few ways that happens, and one of them is that one of these ideas has too much information. And that means that if there's these 2 being compared to one another, then instead of ending up with 3 units of information, let's say we end up with 4.5 units of information. That's positive type schizophrenia. And that's where we see an issue with communicating with other people, because you try to give them too much information at once, and that ends up leading to kind of a repeated attempt to get that point across without it actually ever resolving itself. So when the whole magnitude of this process of combining things together exceeds 3 units, which is what it should be, that's considered positive type schizophrenia. And that is sort of related to all the different symptoms you see. The other thing that will happen is negative type schizophrenia. And in negative type, what you get is an idea, and then you get a connection, but this other idea is either not there, kind of like a blank space, or there's not enough information there. So instead of ending up with 3 units of information, you may only end up with 2 units of information. And in order to fill that disparity, you have to kind of come up with something. You have to imagine something. You have to kind of make something up. And it's not that you're trying to do it in a bad way, it's just that you're being prompted to communicate, and there's nothing there to kind of make sense of that meaning that's been created. So that gives us the idea of kind of positive and negative schizophrenia. But according to standard theory, the only reason that's happening is because of the first characteristic of communication. So we can attribute schizophrenia to some problem with the first characteristic. And essentially what we have to do now from the first characteristic is work our way back and figure out what else is wrong. And we solve that problem all the way back to the components of impulse. We resolve all that stuff. We either try to get rid of that extra information, or we try to supplement what's going on with more information. And then hopefully, once we get back to the first characteristic, everything is back to normal. Everything happens, hopefully everything will happen in that kind of congruent way, and it'll equal exactly 3 units that we need. So that's essentially how standard theory explains what's going on with schizophrenia. And that's sort of the inability to constructively and congruently obtain that self-identification. There's some problem. Either there's too much stimulation in combining those ideas, or there's not enough stimulation in combining those ideas, and that leads to positive and negative schizophrenia. And if that's the case, we can stop there. If we're going from here, from the Z0 scale to the R scale, and we have a problem at the first characteristic, we know there's a problem there, and we know that everything else that happens after that is going to be abnormal, so we can stop there. And that allows us to look at schizophrenia in terms of a specific characteristic. So in bipolar disorder, the one we're talking about here is the physical type, and this is a problem with the second characteristic. And this is the result of being unable to achieve access to the rest of the R scale. So if you think about bipolar disorder, the physical type, I'm not sure if it's exactly the same as the ones that are in the DSM. There may be some kind of bleed over one way or the other. But according to standard theory, physical type bipolar disorder is related specifically to a block in neurochemistry. There is a sort of overactivity of the inhibitory molecules. So even if you try to communicate with someone, or even if you're prompted for communication, you would be unable to achieve that level of activation because of all that neurochemistry, because of all those problems. And as a result of that, communication seems to break down very often, and people who struggle with this, their manic phase is very angry and very upset, and kind of very, not necessarily confrontational, but they're struggling to get their point across, and that's kind of what leads to the manic symptoms. And the depressive symptoms are very much indicative of like a self-victimization. They feel very remorseful. They feel very sad. They're very upset with themselves because they were just trying to communicate, but for some reason it didn't go across, and that's kind of the result, kind of the definition of intimacy dysfunction. So similarly, we know that if this is our problem with the second characteristic, we can stop there, and we can kind of work our way back and try to fix what's going on. And anything that we do beyond that is going to be abnormal. So next we can move to all of these here. The third characteristic. So if you remember, the third characteristic of communication is a free will junction. And that is the thing that allows us to choose whether or not we move our attention from ourselves to another person, or whether we keep focusing on ourselves. So with these problems with ADD, essentially what we're seeing is a continued inward orientation. With ADHD, we're seeing a continued outward orientation. With OCD, we're seeing a orientation and disorientation, and the only thing that's allowing us to do that is some kind of behavior, which is a part of something called compensatory behavior, which is the abnormal version of the third characteristic. And we also see depression, wherein we try to avoid either communicating with another person, or we avoid our self-interaction in favor of some other kind of lower level of activation. So if we work our way up to there and all these other stuff are normal, then we can figure out which one of these are going on at that level, whether it's forcing or avoiding the whole process, whether it's not being able to choose between inward and outward orientation, or whether there's some behavior that becomes associated with achieving that orientation. And that all of those processes are just part of some issue with the free will junction, essentially. And another thing that kind of goes along with that is anxiety, but that's more closely related to the fourth characteristic. Depression is also related to the fourth characteristic, and it's worth mentioning that depression does have the silent type, which is the sort of avoidance of working on yourself, the avoidance of talking to other people. There's also the relational type, where you force yourself to get into a situation, or you actively avoid getting into that situation. So it's kind of similar. That's sort of the difference between physical type depression, which has something to do with your own ideas about things, your own body status, and your own orientation, your silent orientation. And there's also relational depression, which deals with actually obtaining sufficient amount of silent communication, but still avoiding others and avoiding yourself. So the silent type of depression is really the thing that people recommend, like exercise and diet, to address, and sometimes medication. And then the relational depression is a different type that people will say to do social things with, to do spontaneous stuff and to interact with others. So those two are a little bit different than one another, but they're usually thought of as the same thing. So there's kind of the physical type depression, and there's kind of like the relational depression. But there's also anxiety, and that's related to the fourth characteristic of communication. And in the standard sense, anxiety deals with, in the standard sense, the fourth characteristic of communication deals with having that platform to communicate with others. That's when you go through the sufficient amount of silent communication, and you turn your orientation outward to someone else, and then you prepare to communicate with them. In anxiety, you aren't really sure one way or the other if you're able to communicate with somebody else. That's kind of the whole process that goes along with that. And it sort of does bleed over into the fifth characteristic as well, and that's being unsure if somebody else is going to be able to communicate with you. So that uncertainty is sort of what drives anxiety. And there's a sort of self-sourced anxiety, and then the sort of relationally sourced anxiety. And then beyond that, we have PTSD and personality disorders. Both of these are also part of the fifth characteristic of communication. And PTSD is kind of difficult to explain, but if you remember the standard version of the fifth characteristic, that deals with interpreting what your experience was whenever you have that dynamic exchange with people. And essentially, once you push your activation all the way to the fifth and sixth characteristic, there's usually some kind of overload event, and then you sort of interpret either in a positive or negative way whether there was a positive or negative overload event. And with PTSD, what will happen is that interpretation, instead of it being the primary excitatory neurotransmitters, it becomes associated with essentially a fear or fight or flight response, like adrenaline or something like that. So unfortunately, what will happen is that you'll kind of be forced out all the way out of the R scale and somewhere into the Z scale. And the complex PTSD will take you beyond the normal limit of the Z scale. But normal personality disorder will potentially only take you to the normal limit. But the other thing that goes along with personality disorder is a mismatch between how you interpret that orientation and the kind of resulting identity. So that's what leads to personality disorder. Sometimes it's positive. You go through the exact same experience again, and for some reason it's negative. You go through the exact same experience again, and it's positive again. You go through the exact same experience again, it's positive. You go through the experience again, it's negative. So that mismatch is kind of what leads to personality disorder. But PTSD is having that mismatch, but with some other kind of extreme symptom going on. So those are both related to the fifth characteristic, along with anxiety, which is not being sure whether or not you can facilitate that whole process. So finally, we have autism, which is what happens at the sixth characteristic. And there are two types of autism according to standard theory. There's a positive type autism, and there's a negative type autism. The positive type is related to a continued or kind of a disproportional release of that neurotransmitter. It's, not necessarily the transmitter specifically, but a disproportionate amount of overactivation of that overload event. There's way more of it than there should be. And as a result, people will continue doing things until they match that amount of stimulation. And that's sort of something that can be caused by parenting, and can be caused by all kinds of stuff. But there's also the negative type of autism, wherein you continually push the activation to that level, but there isn't a release of neurotransmitter. So you spend a kind of disproportionate amount of time or energy on doing something without that overload event and without that release of neurotransmitter. And as a result, you're able to deal with tasks that other people may find boring, or tasks that otherwise do not end up being reciprocated by people. And as a result of that, you can continue those tasks or focus on them maybe much longer than you would otherwise. And then alternately, you also do not necessarily seek out that activation. There's no reason, since you have some other experience that goes along with it. It just was not necessarily associated with that overload event. So that's sort of how autism is explained through standard theory. And then we have bulimia and anorexia, which are also part of self-interaction disorder, which is the second characteristic of communication. And if you remember, to the standard version of the behavioral index, the second characteristic is all about self-interaction. It's about your diet. It's about, it deals with your eating habits. It deals with how much you sleep and all that stuff. So bulimia is just part of going through your self-interaction and not having that process resolved and then vomiting for some reason. So it's kind of, we think of it as a feeding disorder. And anorexia is not participating. It's kind of disproportionate amount of avoidance of your sort of intake. And there are a bunch more that fit under the second characteristic. So like sleeping disorders can fit there. Other types of intake disorders can fit there. Things like sleepwalking and all that kind of stuff. Those things are all part of self-interaction because it involves the body status. So any other aspect of a diagnosis in the DSM or whatever, in the diagnostic dictionary, anything that relates directly to the body status has to do with the second characteristic. So that gives us a dozen different diagnoses, and we've gotten to this much of the behavioral index. And all of these are some problem in the step of getting to constructive intimacy. So all of those things are the same problem. It's just the degree to which they occur, kind of the level of activation at which you see them happening. And that kind of allows you to look at all of these as the same thing, which is intimacy dysfunction. And that deals with some problem potentially in the Z-naught scale, not necessarily, but from the first characteristic all the way to the sixth characteristic. So just these right here, these two right here, are going to be intimacy dysfunction. And all of these fit in the category of intimacy dysfunction, according to standard theory. So that's most of the DSM and most of the diagnostic dictionary. That's what most people are going to be dealing with. And the kind of terminal problem that's happening here is that you're having some problem communicating one-on-one with somebody. You're having some problem getting to the point where you can directly express what you're going through in a way that the other person can understand. They can kind of interpret that and then let you know what you're going through. And along the way, there's going to be one of these problems potentially that are going to prevent you from doing that. So I'm kind of rushing through this, but if you look at the sort of progression through these, what you'll notice is, if you get to the first characteristic and there's a problem, you stop there. You don't think, okay, there's a problem there, and then there's also a problem here, and then there's also a problem there, because all that is going to be based on the lowest kind of threshold factor. So for that reason, it makes it much easier to actually find the root cause of the problems, because even if you're dealing with schizophrenia, and you're dealing with ADD, and you're dealing with depression, and all that stuff, if you don't fix the first characteristic, it's going to be tough to say that any other ones are going to really follow along with it. And I think that thinking about things in that kind of most simple to most complex way allows you to find the root problem rather than saying, well, there's some symptoms of this, some symptoms of that, some symptoms here, and then just trying to pick and choose one of them. So now we have a ordered way to look at which problem is the most fundamental problem. So in that way, you can determine which one of these things to fix. You don't have to try to do this, try to do that. And we know that we can stop once we get to that process. We can stop once we get to depression and then work backwards and fix it, and then try to move on from there. So I think that hopefully can change the way that we think about it. And the thing that's on my mind is misdiagnosing people just because they have all of these problems, but we just don't know what the base problem is. And I think that if we're just using symptoms and trying to mix and match them, we kind of have to do the best we can. But if we can find like the basis for each of these, like the most fundamental, like lowest threshold problem, we should be able to solve all of those in a way that cuts down on misdiagnosing and so forth. But anyway, all of these are just intimacy dysfunction, which is one of the primary types of problems that standard theory deals with. There are two other types, and besides intimacy dysfunction, we have something called social identity disorder. And the third type is something called irregular impulse. So unfortunately, it's very difficult to correlate the social identity disorder and the irregular impulse to what the DSM says, because most of what the DSM deals with is symptoms, and in social identity disorder, the problem isn't a symptom that a person's going through. The problem is a relationship between people. And unfortunately, in the DSM and the diagnostic dictionary, it can be very difficult to source the fact that the thing that the person is going through is really related to a relationship rather than being related to their own internal environment. And separating those are very difficult. There are a couple of things you can think of, like Hosted syndrome and that kind of thing. There's also the whole idea of the prison experiment, where the person would take their orders from the other individual rather than thinking about how it is affecting the other person. So those are all aspects of social identity disorder, but they're not really well-defined categories when it comes to the DSM, because they're based on symptoms rather than focusing on the relationship as the cause of that symptom or the cause of that problem. But standard theory has its own set of issues that go along with it. And then the same for regular impulse. And a regular impulse is sort of the closest that you can get to thinking about standard theory in terms of being based on symptoms and being based on that type of observable behavior. And the idea with a regular impulse is that the dysresolution from somewhere in the R scale sort of leads to the point where the normal range of the Z scale is not sufficient to solve that problem. And as a result, you end up with a behavioral kind of anomaly. So it's normal to experience impulse. It's normal in the living brain to experience those things, but it's really to the point that it leads to that abnormal behavior, and then it starts affecting other people, that it really becomes a problem. And it's that observable change, that observable behavior, or that observable problem that really makes a difference in going through those things. The other side of a regular impulse is something called the physical kind of aspect of those. Excuse me. And that's how the developmental disorders are classified, with things like the growth delays and those kinds of conditions. Rather than there being too much impulse or an irregular amount of impulse, there is a kind of complete block to get there because that structure had not developed, or because there's some other delay in getting the actual physical structure connected in order to make that impulse happen. So the original type of irregular impulse is pushed us all the way through the Z0 scale, the R scale, past the gap, into the Z scale, and then a little bit further. And the physical type of irregular impulse is going to start all the way back to the Z0 scale. So those are kind of the three primary ways that you can organize those diseases that are seen in the DSM. And there's a little bit more to talk about in terms of theory as to which one of those is like the terminal version. Everything else about standard theory is very deterministic, but it really depends on what the person's going through. In my opinion, intimacy dysfunction is the kind of terminal thing, but in reality, all three of these can influence one another. Intimacy dysfunction can have some influence on social identity disorder. Identity disorder can influence irregular impulse, and irregular impulse can consequently lead to intimacy dysfunction, and so on. And intimacy dysfunction can lead to irregular impulse. Irregular impulse can manifest itself if you get that far. You can get regular impulse contributing to social identity disorder, and the social identity disorder, depending on how you learn those things and what those relationships are like, can potentially contribute to intimacy dysfunction. So to me, intimacy dysfunction is the goal, but even if you don't have a problem with intimacy dysfunction, you can still have a problem with social identity disorder. So that makes kind of social identity disorder the kind of terminal thing. And then similarly, you may not deal with either of these because you have some kind of physical type of impulse or whatever. But according to standard theory, we can kind of narrow down any of the problems we're dealing with into one of those three categories. So where the DSM has several different, probably a dozen or so different categories, we only need those three to explain anything else that you may see in the DSM. So even the ones that are kind of not well defined or kind of have a sort of kind of weird set of symptoms or anything like that, we can deterministically attribute those to one of those three problems, either intimacy dysfunction, social identity disorder, and irregular impulse. And then just to take that a step further, we can look at sexuality in the same way. The reason that people go through like the kinks and stuff like that, and sexuality, we can look at it the same way. I think it's mentioned in the book version. I'm not sure if we've mentioned it in the video version yet, but sexuality is very similar. It kind of mirrors this exact same pattern. They're just a different requirement when it comes to achieving all the things we need, all the prerequisites to getting into the R scale. And with libido and sexuality, one of those things deals with the release of hormones, which is a biologic explanation as to why that happens, and brain chemistry and stuff. But essentially, we have to get through to the Z scale, and then we have to meet all these requirements again. And one of those requirements in sexuality happens to be certain types of hormones. And then from there, we can experience not only kind of the sexual version of the behavioral index, but we can also experience the standard and non-standard versions of them. And along with the standard and non-standard sexual versions, we can also, even though the hormone may be part of that prerequisite, whether it is or not, we can also experience the standard and non-standard behavioral index and not necessarily be focused on sex. But once we unlock that hormone and add that to our prerequisites, we can also deal with the sexuality disorders. And the idea is that the abnormal versions of the sexuality disorders have some fundamental basis in the characteristics and the processes, and that's what leads into dysfunction, social identity disorder, and impulse irregularity in that sense as well. So that gives us a way to look at basically any condition that's in the DSM, along with recognizing some additional things about why a person is going through what they're going through. So these are the only, while the DSM has all these dozen categories or whatever, these are the only things that we have to look at and figure out which one of those problems are leading to our observed abnormal process. But once we have that, to organize them and to categorize them, that's basically all we need, are the intimacy dysfunction, social identity disorders, and the irregular impulse. And I don't think I mentioned, which I think is probably worth mentioning, social identity disorder is essentially the social communication type, the shared communication type, the absolute communication type. So those some issue with those aspects are kind of sort of group that set of things in that way, and it's all about replacing the external environment with one-on-one communication, and it's also related to how we group and sort that information, and it's also related to the relationships that we have. So that gives us these communication types right here being part of intimacy dysfunction. That gives us these right here being part of social identity disorder, and then we see the results of all that stuff, the irregular part of that, and irregular impulse. We also see it here, but it's an argument as to whether or not that's standard or non-standard. And then we also see irregular impulse here. Whether or not you consider rolling communication to be standard or non-standard, they're kind of both non-standard, but it just depends on how you kind of look at them. But that essentially tells us which disease process is going to be part of which communication type. So that's what allows us to look at illnesses and diseases in a much more deterministic way than all these different categories that the DSM gives us. So that is essentially how we address the traditional diagnoses using the same set of rules as everything else using standard theory. So now that we have all this, there's one other thing that I want to address, which is a severity criteria. And I think it's been brought up a couple times already, but essentially what we do is we look at which of these characteristics is being affected, and then we look at how badly it's influencing the entire process of that self-expression. And the thing that we relate that to is the level of memory at which that thing has become seated. And if we look at the standard version of cyclic thinking, everything is very congruent. You're comparing things that are easily deemed to be similar, and you look at things that are easily comparable and kind of store well together in memory. And if that's the case, then you kind of have a way to categorize how much comparison is being happened whenever you get to like a sort of emergent situation, kind of like as time goes on. And the idea is that once you experience an abnormal thing, you should have some way to resolve it, even if it's thinking of it as of it, excuse me, even if you think of it as being abnormal. But even if that is the case, you can still store that information in some alternate ratio, or you can have some unresolved information that's kind of still stored there. And the measure of how bad that is how that abnormal or kind of poorly stored information influences the emergence of things as time goes on. And that is sort of what leads us into defining how bad those things are. And I know we've probably brought those up, but I'll just go ahead and kind of do a brief overview so we can see what those different levels are. So in cyclic thinking, if you remember back to the other videos, we had a couple different levels of the cyclic thinking. And the first one is the zero factor, and that's just information that is not going to be part of what you're experiencing. It's just information that you had not yet been exposed to. And another way to think of the zero factor is just missing information. So that gives us a way to talk about things that are not actually stored in memory, but may be considered. It's a way for us to think of a blank space. And it's just another way for us to think about the complexity that's happening. And that complexity just means that once we start considering different levels, it's just something that had not been stored in memory. So that's kind of the idea of the zero factor. And in our first factor, the only thing we have is some experience. There's some information that's up there, and then we essentially put our attention to it. And that gives us what we call circular thinking. And that's very closely related to just raw environmental experience. And once we have that, if it is thought about being meaningful, there's a potential for that to be stored in a more long-term way. So we kind of move this experience down here, and we have this now, and then something else may happen. We have some other new experience that will happen, and we have to try to make a comparison between the thing that we've experienced previously, and then we have to make a determination as to whether or not what we've already experienced is related to whatever new is happening. And if these are similar, like almost exactly the same, like let's say this idea represents a tree, and then you see a different tree, but otherwise all of the aspects of it seem more or less the same, then there's no reason to store this in memory, and this doesn't change. But let's say you see a tree, and that the idea that goes along with this is a tree with green leaves. Then you see another tree, but it has more reddish or brown leaves. Then for that reason, you can say, well, that looks like a tree, but something about it's different. If that is the case, what you can do is just group that together as part of your idea of what a tree is. And even though you've seen a tree, you say, well, I've seen a tree that has green leaves, and that fits all those kind of criteria. Then you can also say, I've seen a tree, but this tree, even though I kind of think of it as the same thing, has something different about it. But they're close enough that they're comparable enough that you can group them together, but there's still something different about it. And that's sort of what allows you to store that as meaningful in memory, even though you're already somewhat familiar with it. And that's the idea of ovular thinking. So once you accept this, you store that kind of deeper into your memory, and that becomes more deeply seated. So now you know what trees are, but you also know that there are different types of trees, and you know that even though they're similar, they can have differences among them, and that still allows you to have these and have them grouped together. So now that you have this idea of trees and the different things that can go along with them, you may see something else. And instead, this may be like a lamppost. And you say, okay, well, they kind of have the same shape, they're kind of tall, there's kind of something near the top of them, but there's no leaves on this lamppost. There's not red leaves, there's not green leaves, but it kind of has the same shape. But instead, there's some kind of some light emanating from it. So for that reason, you no longer try to think of that thing as a tree. You don't try to recognize it as a tree. You can try to recognize it, you kind of sort this information out, and you need to try to recognize this lamppost as like something else, or you may not be able to recognize it yet, and you try to go back to figuring out what it is. And that's sort of what the brain, in theory, that's kind of what the brain is doing when you're committing things to memory. And the other thing that could happen is that you see this new thing, and you think, well, it looks like a tree, and I know that this thing is like maybe a lamppost, but maybe it's a tree that works on electricity. So you try to guess that that may be it. So now you think, well, do trees work on electricity? Is a lamppost a tree that had electricity that ran through it and now it doesn't have leaves? Is electricity required for trees to turn into lampposts? You have to try to figure out how those are related. And really quickly you end up with a lot of different options. And if you remember, this kind of is our limit of our memory as to what we can compare. And there are a few reasons why that seems to be. There's some mathematical explanations behind that, and there are also some biological explanations as to what the structure of the memory centers are able to do, and kind of a limit of combining those kind of populations of ideas. But anyway, once this happens, we end up with something called incongruent thinking. So at the zero factor, we should have zero factor. Here we have circular thinking at the first factor, and then moving to the second factor, we have ovular thinking. In the third factor, we have elliptical thinking, and the fourth factor is incongruent thinking. So if we try to do the same thing with something that is either unresolved, get rid of all these. We can think of all the different things, all the different types of things that can happen. So we can have kind of an unresolved process. We can have an irregular process. We can have a process that has too much information. We can have a process that has too little information. We can have a process that's based on metabolite of something. We can have a process that's related to our salt balance. We can have all number of things that kind of go wrong. And essentially what we deal with are these things being stored in memory. So if we have some irregular kind of process and we put our attention to it and it doesn't resolve itself, there's a chance that we think of that process as not resolving itself. And whenever we think of another process that doesn't resolve itself, we can associate that with it, some other weird thing that's going on with it. And once we have these, we don't know what to put here. We don't know which one of these fits best. Maybe the triangle is going to stick around, and then maybe that square sticks around, and then maybe we have some other weird thing that's going to happen. Now, how do we group those? Is the triangle and the kind of weird asterisk more closely related, or is the square and the asterisk more closely related? How do we resolve that? How do we figure out how to deal with those? That's kind of the process. And in incongruent thinking, not only can we have these weird processes, we also have to compare that to another weird process. And we have to figure out which one of these goes with which one of those kind of is grouped where, and it makes it very difficult to actually make a true association between things. And when we think about the irregular kind of stuff, we think about how long it takes us to resolve that irregular thing. So in the abnormal sense, the first factor is something called a disruption. And that just means we've recognized an abnormal thing. And hopefully what we can do is just recognize that as abnormal, or we just ignore it. That's the best case scenario in that sense. But if we recognize it's an abnormal thing, we end up with something called a derangement. And during a derangement, you recognize the abnormal thing, and you recognize the other abnormal thing, and you associate those with one another. And that's sort of what increases the severity of the problem. Is not only have you stored that irregular thing, you've compared it to something else irregular and made some meaning about that. You've kind of grouped those irregular things together. And then finally you have the sort of third stage, which is referred to as ovular thinking. And in ovular thinking, not only do you have this derangement, but you're trying to make a new decision based on that derangement. And if that continues, or if something else is brought into that equation, not only do you have the derangement to figure out, you have to figure out which of those derangements are best to use, and then which of those other things are more closely related to that derangement. And the problem is that many times it's not easy to tell which of those are similar, but it is very easy to tell that they're not alike. So when it comes to the severity of a problem, we just think about how far that abnormal process. So let's say we're dealing with schizophrenia. This would represent our initial experience of whatever is causing that schizophrenia, whether it be a medication, whether it be too much information, whether it be too little information, whether you attempt to make a connection between things but you don't have enough energy to do it. That's sort of our whole process of it. And what should happen in a disruptive sense is that you try that process, it fails, and then you just kind of go to the next thing or try something else. But if that problem perpetuates itself, then you realize, I can't do this thing. You realize that there's some problem, you realize there's not enough information around, you realize there's too much information, and that becomes stored in memory as something that is meaningful, but is proven to be non-standard. And then at the second level, you try to use that understanding of your limitation to view something else that's kind of limited. You use it to view something else that is non-standard. And once you do that, you increase the severity. In the first level, that severity is not very bad. As soon as you determine that it's not possible, you just move on to the next thing. But if you store that information and then use it to have the sort of abnormal thing as your foundation of understanding, you compare it to another abnormal thing. And that leads to recognizing other abnormal things in relation to whatever was wrong in the first place. So at the first level, it's usually something that's not going to cause you much problem beyond experiencing it. And then maybe it's a loud sound, maybe somebody drops something and it kind of takes your attention for a second. You think, okay, I recognize what's happening. It was kind of deranged, and you kind of move on from there. At that first level, that's just referred to as a disruption. So that has very little lasting effect. It's kind of very temporary. You can usually figure that, okay, that's abnormal, and so on. But depending on that, it may lead to the more severe version of it, which is called a derangement. And in a derangement, normally if you are around something that reminds you of whatever that process was, it will probably bring that derangement back into light. It will kind of persist in memory, so that when you come up along something else that's deranged, it may remind you of that thing that happened. So when you're thinking about the disruption, you may think of maybe somebody dropped a utensil and it's like, okay, it's not a big deal. But if you think about a derangement, maybe somebody spilled like some like hot coffee on you, and you think, oh my gosh, that was painful. You think about all the kind of consequences of that, and the next time you're around coffee, you may kind of back up a little bit and think, oh, I remember that time that somebody spilled coffee on me and it was painful. That's kind of what's happening here. Even though the thing that you're viewing is not necessarily non-standard, it's just coffee, you're making that comparison based on something that is non-standard. And that's kind of the severity of a derangement. With the disruption, it's very temporary. It just kind of comes and goes. You think, okay, that's not that bad. With the disruption, it probably will go, with a derangement, it probably will go away. But when you find yourself in a situation that is similar to that, then you're going to use that experience, that disrupted experience, as your foundation for making a new connection between whatever it is that you're seeing. So in a disruption, if you kind of use hot coffee as an example, the thing that you're going to see, maybe you hold the coffee cup, you're like, oh, this is warm, I should set it down until it cools down a little bit, then I can drink it. For some reason you may be able to recognize that. But with the level of a derangement, once you get to the coffee, you probably won't touch it. You're like, it burned me last time I grabbed it. I need to wait, or something bad's going to happen. And you make that you draw that conclusion, you make that association based on something that's been disruptive previously. So you've stored that disruption, and now your new event is being based on that disruption. So what happens after that, if that kind of increases in severity, is that derangement becomes your foundational way to deal with the world around you. So the main difference between one of the main differences between the derangement and the illness phase is that in the derangement phase, you're normally only going to have that happen whenever you're around that thing. So if you use hot coffee as an example, usually when you're around hot coffee, you just may be more cautious and say, well, last time I hurt myself badly because coffee was too hot. But at the illness phase, it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter where you go. Every time you see something, you're going to compare it to scalding hot coffee. You're going to think that if you talk to a person, they're hiding scalding hot coffee behind their back and they're going to throw it at you. That's kind of the level of illness phase. So it doesn't matter where you go. It doesn't matter who you talk to. It doesn't matter which situation you find yourself in. To try to make meaning or comparison to that situation, you're going to use those derangements first and foremost before you do anything else about the situation. And that's kind of the culmination of using those derangements as your method of comparison in emergent situations as time goes on. So if you just had a derangement with something, it would only happen when you were finding yourself in that information. When you find yourself in that situation, that's really the time that you should get that derangement. But in illness phase, any situation, any given situation, is going to be based on that time that scalding hot coffee hurt you. That's going to be kind of the difference. It doesn't matter if you're drinking an ice cold glass of juice or water or something. You're still going to think about that time that coffee burned you, and that's going to kind of be your foundational thing. Even though you may have like ice cold glass of juice or something, you're still going to be thinking about the time that thing happened. And the other issue with illness is that people don't realize they're doing it. They don't realize that what they're comparing is essentially a perpetuated derangement. They don't realize that that's what they're using to make sense of their world. And at that level, normally you can just counsel people. You can kind of intervene by, the whole idea of talking through their problems and that kind of stuff. So at that level, you can still try to change what's going on with these. You can still try to say that, this ice cold juice isn't going to hurt you. You're only thinking about that because of the coffee. And if you think of that time being that you had an ice cold glass of juice instead of having been burned by that coffee, then maybe you can structure how you group and sort those a little bit differently. But finally, if that continues long enough, a person's going to realize it doesn't matter what I do, coffee is going to hurt me. It doesn't matter if it's juice, it doesn't matter if it's a blanket, it doesn't matter if somebody else is smiling at me, coffee is going to hurt me. And that's how they enter into their method of figuring out which one of these to sort. So this one's always going to be itself. That's kind of the kind of only thing that you can use to associate that problem is that perpetuated illness, essentially. And that perpetuated illness ends in a mismatch. That's the whole thing. Is it ends up in something non-standard, and you start leading with that. You only look for non-standard stuff at that point, and you only try to find things that are wrong. And you try to figure out how wrong is it. And by figuring out how wrong it is, you can determine how to group and sort these things. Which one of these is the most wrong? And that's kind of what gives us the level of incongruent thinking. There's no reason necessarily to think that, even if you went through it, and even if you've been through it that number of times, there's no reason to think that as time moves on, that things will always be that way. But when you perpetuate that illness, then there's no other way to address that problem, because everything is based on the deranged version of things rather than the standard version. So that disruption at that point is moved all the way from your first experience all the way down to the kind of the deepest parts of your memory, where now you're kind of locked into that idea that something is wrong. And that's kind of what constitutes a true disease. And at that point, the other kind of criteria that go along with it is that the brain is not able to correct it on its own. It's not able to correct it without medicine. It's not able to correct it without lots and lots of intervention. It's not something that's going to get better necessarily in a couple of days. It's going to take quite a bit of doing. And that's kind of the dynamic that goes along with the true disease phase. The other thing that goes along with it is that people refuse to change it. They refuse to believe that there's something out there that can be standard. They refuse to believe that you could resolve that in a different way, and they refuse to believe in alternatives. And at that point, you can't help them. You have to give them resources, but you can't follow them through it, because anything that they do at that point is going to be a demonstration of their disease. It's going to be a demonstration of that abnormalness. And if they don't see that, they're going to try to demonstrate the fact that being deranged or being abnormal is possible. So it takes quite a lot to restructure that, and that's kind of why it's referred to as incongruent. But when it comes to our diseases, the intimacy dysfunction, you see if intimacy dysfunction is all the way to this level, if the identity disorder is this level, or the impulse is to this level, or if you see it's one of the other levels. But this is kind of the true disease phase. And in my own opinion, this is the only point where you should need to medicate someone. This is the only point where medication is really necessary, and hopefully we can discuss why that is, and see why medication may not be a good option at one of these other phases, because essentially it's just going to create some abnormal thing. It's going to alter the components of impulse, or it's going to replace some other kind of neurochemistry, or it's going to add some stimulation that otherwise has no basis in environmental experience, and that's going to lead to just kind of the perpetuation of that abnormal process. So you're kind of just replacing this disruption with a pill, so that at that point you know that this is disrupted, you know this is disrupted, you know this is disrupted, and you see how they handle that disruption. But that's going to lead to them thinking that everything's disrupted. The only thing I can deal with is a disruptive process. And furthermore, once you remove that medication, or once a person is non-compliant, or once they just no longer have access to it, or whatever the case may be, now not only do you have them going back through their normal kind of constructive version of things, now you still have all of these different experiences that have been associated with this disruption or derangement. So there are very few situations where it seems helpful to actually use medication to fix any of these things. It's only until this has happened naturally, or through some other kind of thing, that you can use medication to fix or counteract whatever other thing happened. But that's essentially as far as we have to look when it comes to severity. And once again, that's related to the physical limitations of the brain. That's related to a couple of ratios, some kind of physical and mathematical limits as to why that's as far as it goes. And that gives us the level of severity that happens. So we can look at very general and say, well, we have a intimacy dysfunction at the derangement phase. Or we can say we have an intimacy dysfunction at the disease phase. Or we can say we just have a disruptive intimacy dysfunction. We can also say that we have a disruptive irregular impulse. We can say we have a deranged irregular impulse, or an irregular impulse that leads to derangement, and so on. We can have a disease level social identity disorder, and then from there we can get more specific. So if we need to, we can talk about a illness at the second characteristic of communication. We can talk about a derangement at the 16th characteristic of communication. We can talk about a disease at negative 187 characteristics of communication. We can talk about a disease in the component of subtraction. Any given aspect, we can just look at either the category that it's in or the specific characteristic, and then we can recognize how deep in memory that has become. And along with that, we can use kind of the associated phenomenon. So disruption is very fleeting. It happens, you kind of realize it happens and move on. The derangement means that it happens and you remember it happened, and if something kind of similar to that kind of comes about, you compare that situation based on the derangement rather than basing it on raw experience. And with the illness phase, you make every comparison based on those perpetuated derangements. You've gone through enough of them, and you think that everything is related to a derangement. And every new situation you have, you try to find the derangement in that situation rather than trying to resolve it. And then finally, in the fourth level, you lead with the derangement. It's always that derangement's going to happen, whether I see it or not. If it doesn't happen, I'm going to demonstrate that it does happen. So that's sort of the differences between cyclic thinking, but that's how we deal with the traditional kind of ideas of illness and the traditional kind of ideas of severity versus what the DSM and what the diagnostic criteria say.